All right. Hi, everyone. I think we're going to get started. So thank you very much for joining us today for the 5th edition of the Ask an Expert Webinar Series titled Navigating Offshore Wind, Approaches for Planning, Development, Construction, and Operation, hosted by Marine Renewables Canada. Our webinar today is going to focus on how offshore wind projects advance through initial planning phases through to operation. So you're going to hear firsthand about the steps taken by a developer to successfully develop a project, and that includes procurement, financing, business case preparation, and environmental considerations. My name is Elisa Oberman. I'm the Executive Director at MRC, and I'm going to be your host for today. So I think quite a few of you that are joining us today know who MRC is or you're members of ours, but if there's any new faces joining us, we're the National Industry Association that covers tidal, offshore wind, wave, and river current energy. And we've been hosting these webinars with experts throughout the last year and a half or so to tackle Canadians' biggest questions about offshore wind as we prepare, and explore what the future for offshore wind is going to look like in Canada. So before we get started, I do want to take a moment to recognize and acknowledge the traditional territories and Indigenous peoples of the different lands that we are all on today. I'm hosting this webinar for Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. And given that we're coming together today to discuss offshore wind, I also invite all of us to think about the impacts that renewable energy projects can have on Indigenous communities and how we can improve our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures to ensure that marine renewable energy projects move forward inclusively and respectfully. So before turning this over to our expert guest today, just a few housekeeping notes. You'll notice we are recording this webinar, so it's going to be posted on our website and YouTube page following the webinar, so sometime tomorrow likely. The bulk of today's webinar, and some of you may also be familiar with this, it will be focused on a presentation, and then it's going to be followed by a question period. So the intent is really, this is for you. It's for those wanting to learn more about a certain topic related to offshore wind. So I really encourage you to ask as many questions as you'd like. Use the Q&A function or the chat function, and we'll do our best to get to as many of those as possible. But please feel free to type questions, as they come to you, and we'll get to them at the end. So now I'd like to welcome our expert guest speaker, who we're very pleased to have here with us today. Sean McDermott is Director, Commercial Development at Northland Power, one of Canada's largest green energy project developers. He joined Northland in 2016 and relocated to Taiwan to develop the 1,044 megawatt Hai Long offshore wind projects and the Taiwan Round 3 projects, with emphasis on securing and negotiating corporate power purchase agreements. So it was very well suited for the topic today. Sean and his family have now relocated to his hometown of Halifax, Nova Scotia, just this past August, from where he continues to provide local and global support for the development of early stage offshore wind projects. So Sean, thank you so much for being here for today and giving us some of your time. And I think now it's over to you. So let's get started and you can share your screen.
Great. Thank you, Elisa and MRC, for the invitation. I'm excited today to share what I can. I would encourage people to ask questions as they come. So to the extent that I'm through the course of the presentation, something pops to mind, feel free to put your hand up and I can pause and take the question. We'll also be doing questions at the end of the session. So between either asking a question as I'm presenting or the time at the end, feel free to put an inquiry out. Typically, if you're, as an audience member for these sorts of presentations from time to time, often when other people ask questions, it's the same thing I've been wondering myself. So jump in as you like. Lisa, you can see my presentation?
I see you. I don't see the presentation yet. I did at one point.
Okay.
Try sharing maybe.
What about now?
Okay, yes, I do.
Yes, great. Okay. Thank you. Okay. So quickly today, these are the topics I'm going to go through as part of the presentation. this is my background, which Lisa just introduced quickly. I think if there's two things from this I'd like to share, it's one that I've been in offshore wind 8 years, renewable energy closer to 15. But two, I'm from Halifax, born and raised here. I left after high school, but came back for law school. So I graduated from Dal Law with specialization in environmental law, worked then in renewable energy law in Toronto before joining Northland 8 years ago, whereupon I moved to Taiwan and worked on our Hai Long project, which I'll talk about a little bit at the end as well. So quickly, as well, Northland Power, we are a Canadian-based independent power producer with assets across the world. We have just over 1,300 employees right now. With onshore wind, solar, offshore wind, thermal, and batteries and transmission operations in multiple locations. So I'll be speaking today from the perspective of offshore wind, but actually our expertise is quite a bit larger than that. Notably, about half of our revenue right now comes from offshore wind, all of which comes from outside of Canada. So we are a Canada-based company, but with a global footprint, and particularly in an offshore wind footprint. So, why offshore wind? What is it about offshore wind that has captured the attention of media, of developers, of governments around the world? Well, I think to start, as I'm sure everyone on the call is aware, there's a global movement to reduce carbon emissions, and a big part of that is transitioning to renewable energy. This comes from a few places. Or the demand for renewable energy comes from a few places. One, as mentioned, is replacing carbon-producing technologies. Two is actually just with new demand for electricity and for power across the world. The renewables are being considered as the new build approach, rather than putting up a new coal, gas, or other thermal facility, where multiple jurisdictions around the world are looking to start with renewables rather than transition to renewables. So it's a combination of those two things broadly, of fuel switching as well as new demand that's driving growth in renewables. Renewable technologies have different advantages for cost, speed, resource availability, and capacity factors. The capacity factor, for those of you who don't know the term, is the percentage of time in a year that the renewable energy technology is available. So a good solar resource is generally available 20 to 25% of a year. We'd say the capacity factor is 20 to 25%. Good onshore wind is typically 30 to 35%. And good offshore wind, it can be 45 to 50%. In some instances, we've seen it a little bit above that. So when we're looking at which renewable energy to deploy, solar typically is quick to put in, and the complexity of construction is lower. The cost of procurement is lower, but it doesn't have the same capacity factor as onshore wind or offshore wind. So part of the appeal to offshore wind as a renewable energy technology is simply that it's available at percentages that are highest above among the renewable energy technologies at the moment. Moreover, in jurisdictions with proximity to the ocean, and with shallow waters, and with strong wind speeds, offshore wind is sort of a natural solution. Another challenge I don't talk about here, but I'm sure some of you have heard or talked about with onshore wind or with solar, is that sometimes they're not welcome in communities. Offshore wind beyond 20, 25 kilometers is typically not visible. And so you don't have the same community pushback sometimes. There's other impacts to offshore wind offshore, to marine ecosystems, sometimes to fisher communities, but generally the community acceptance of offshore wind can be higher if it's far enough offshore that it's not impactful visually. So that brings us to this idea that we're in jurisdictions where it's shallow for long, and you have good wind, and you're close to the ocean. Offshore wind is a natural technology to explore. Offshore wind costs have also been falling dramatically. From 2012 to 2022, the numbers I've seen numbers that suggest they've fallen by as much as 50%. Those have rebounded recently. They've rebounded for lots of technologies and lots of prices across the globe, owing to a range of factors from higher commodity prices, higher financing costs, tight supply chains, which in part came from the demand for offshore wind. And these price pressures have not totally subsided, but they're stabilizing as global inflation interest rates are stabilizing. Just to put this into context as well, when I say, when people might be wondering, where does Nova Scotia, where's Atlantic Canada fall for offshore wind speeds? From this chart, you can see that actually Nova Scotia has some of the best offshore winds in the world. I won't spend too much time on this chart. It's just to give some context for offshore wind. Globally, we have roughly 75 gigawatts of offshore wind operating, and that's a lot. To put that into context, Ontario by itself is 30 to 35 gigawatts, so it's slightly more than all of it's slightly twice what Ontario generates by themselves. But more to the point, as you can see, the forecast from the Global Wind Energy Council shows that you have ongoing increasing offshore wind for years to come, and as that ongoing build out continues, you should see ongoing downward price pressures on capex, and as the supply chains grow larger, become more efficient, and so it will become cheaper and cheaper all across the world, but also for Atlantic Canada. That said, offshore wind isn't easy. There's lots of challenges to it. This is just a short list of some of the complexities. Mostly just come from the challenges of working in marine environments. Building in the ocean is hard, and there's likely many people on this industry from the offshore on this call from the offshore oil and gas industry. They know this better than I do, but there are the complexity of being in the ocean through difficult weather conditions adds cost, adds time, adds delay into building offshore wind. And it is one of the reasons that, notwithstanding offshore wind has a high capacity factor relative to other renewable energy technologies, it's still more expensive. It's more expensive because of the size and the complexity. But the overall, the trade-off of the cost versus the generation and the higher capacity factor is worth it. We're balanced. The higher costs and the higher risk and some of these higher challenges are offset by the higher wind speeds and the bigger scale of production, which is to say that it's much easier to get to 1,000 megawatts of offshore wind than it is 1,000 megawatts of onshore wind or solar, and the higher availability. When we think of Atlantic Canada, then, and why offshore wind for Atlantic Canada, it's because we have great wind, we have good ports, we have a growing supply chain that can switch, that has experience in offshore oil and gas and can transition. We have wonderful geotechnical underwater conditions, which is to say we're shallow for far. And we have a great regulatory support from the provincial and federal government, and we have a workforce that's eager to work, so, and experienced in marine conditions. So offshore wind is a good fit for Atlantic Canada and for Nova Scotia. So the next parts of the presentation, I'm going to just talk a little bit more about what a typical offshore wind farm looks like. This is just a pretty basic graph or overview of the main components of an offshore wind farm. I'll just say from the beginning, no two wind farms are alike. In this project or in this graph, we're showing turbines on a jacket foundation. Actually, jacket is one of 3 to 4 common kinds of fixed bottom foundations, and then increasingly we're seeing offshore. We're seeing floating foundations in offshore wind. The number of operating floating projects right now is relatively small, but the pipeline for new floating is very significant. And floating offshore wind offers the opportunity to get into even deeper water and access even more ocean geography. So a lot of time, money, and resources is going into developing floating technology. For the purpose of this presentation and this slide, I'm mostly focused on I'll be talking mostly in fixed bottom, because that's Northland. We have 3 operating wind farms. There are and 2 in construction, all of which are fixed bottom. But the floating is going to be an important part of the future for offshore wind. Also, not in every offshore wind farm is the substation, the offshore transformer substation. That's a common part of newer projects, but as projects get bigger, but the earliest projects often just brought cables directly to shore. So you won't see an offshore substation in every operating wind farm as well. Nonetheless, this graph mostly shows what most wind farms look like, and to the point, a lot of what's here demonstrates what it is the offshore developer is responsible for building, permitting, building, financing, and operating, which is to start the turbines, then the foundations, then the array cables, which are the cables which connect the individual turbines to an offshore substation, the offshore substation itself, and then the offshore export cable. Typically, the voltage in the offshore substations is at the voltage in the offshore turbines are lower than that of the export cable. So you have multiple array cables that come together in the offshore substation, where the voltage is stepped up and put into a single export cable to take to shore. At the onshore transformer station, it's stepped down again and put into the grid. So the offshore developers are typically responsible for everything from the turbine through to the onshore substation. And that can vary by jurisdiction. In some jurisdictions, the offshore substation is managed by the grid offshore. In some jurisdictions, we will sell to a private transmission provider rather than the public transmission provider. But nonetheless, from the perspective of the developer, we tend to prefer to have responsibility for this full scale of the project, because it allows us to have certainty on the timing and delivery of everything. There have been examples where offshore wind farms in Europe were built before the offshore substations were complete. The offshore substations were managed by the grid operator, those rare instances where the projects are built before the grid is ready is not ideal for the developer. And so where we can, we prefer to have full control over the turbines, the foundations, the cables, the offshore substation, the export cable, and the onshore substation. The project lifecycle. So Some of the conversations I've had with people in Nova Scotia since I arrived here just 2 months ago is how long does this take? And for people in Nova Scotia or the Atlantic Canada who are familiar with solar or onshore, those can take time, particularly the upfront permitting, but the actual construction of onshore or solar typically is, and financing typically is faster than offshore. This is sort of a sample the development cycle or project life cycle that shows that from when you start investigating your site to when you finish operations and commission, it can take 8 to 12 years. Sometimes faster, sometimes slower, but to put that into context, I moved to Taiwan to work on our 1,022 megawatt Hai Long project. I moved to Taiwan in 2016. The project was already 1 year in development when I moved there. So it started in 2015. The project will not be fully commissioned until 2027. So that's 12 years to get that project from beginning to full operation. That's on the longer end of it for reasons relating to sort of construction schedules in Taiwan and specific procurement and permitting regulations. But nonetheless, the process of building an offshore wind farm or taking it from concept through to permitting, through to development, through to offtake, through to financing, through procurement, through to engineering, to construction and to commissioning is a long, expensive process. In the onshore wind and solar world, there's hundreds, thousands of companies that can do that. In the offshore wind space, there's dozens of us. It's not a big range of companies, and they tend to be large companies because of the capex and the complexity of putting projects and the time of putting projects of this scale together. So it's a long process. For the remainder of this presentation, I'm going to talk about some of these topics in a little bit more detail. Again, if and when people have specific questions, feel free to speak up. Otherwise, we can save them for the for Q&A at the end. So I'll start with site selection. When we're looking at a area, what is it that we're looking for? Well, the first thing is how good is the wind? There are parts of the world where there's efforts to develop offshore wind that are struggling a little bit because the wind speeds aren't excellent. You do want to ensure that the wind that you have is consistent and measurable. So typically we put out a floating LiDAR. The other met masts are put out, and a met mast is sort of put out as typically a fixed foundation in the ocean waters to capture data, or a floating LiDAR will be put out. Often for at least a year, but often 2 to 3 years to capture multiple seasons of data. In the renewable energy space, and particularly in the lender space, you'll hear reference to P90, P50, P10 as reference points. Not everyone knows what that means. So the P in front of the numbers refers to probability. And P90, P50, P10 looks to establish a baseline for, in any given year, how many hours of generation are you likely to have. So this is sometimes also referred to as the 8760 analysis. 8760 or 8,760 being the number of hours in a year. We talked earlier about capacity factors as the amount of generation that a renewable energy technology will typically have in a year, but that generation is not consistent. It changes through the season, certainly for solar, and it can change through the season for onshore and offshore wind as well, depending on your location. So the P50, the P10, the P90 profiles in your business case aim to take a view in a year. How many hours will you be generating 90% of the time, 50% of the time, 10% of the time? Sorry, that's not right. 90% with the 90% probability, with a 50% probability, with a 10% probability. So the P90 is sort of your lowest case, P10 is the highest. And it just reflects the fact that renewable energy is intermittent, and it will change quarter to quarter, year to year, but you want to have confidence in that P90 and what the baseline is. So we use once we have a sense of the P90 or P50 wind speeds, then we use that as a business case to go forward. Water depth, you want to be, the water depth topic is really important around determining what kind of foundation you'll use. And historically, monopiles have been used in the shallowest water depths, and then, which is say up to 30, maybe 40 meters. Jackets are used beyond that, something from 30 maybe to 60, or I've seen up to 80 meters. And then beyond 80 meters or beyond 100 meters, the cost of steel and the cost of insulation and the weight of the foundations makes installation difficult and or production expensive. So the projects that are pursuing anything beyond 80 to 100 meters tend to be floating projects, and floating can go to much deeper waters. But a big part of determining where you want to be is the water depth. As a general rule, the shallower the water, the cheaper the foundation, which helps improve your capital expenditures. Seabed conditions. What are you drilling in? What's there that you might disrupt or that will make the construction more or less difficult? In Northern Europe, a lot of the early projects were located in areas that had been mined through World War I and World War II. So unexploded ordnance was a huge consideration. In Nova Scotia, as we think about moving out to areas in and around where we've had historic gas fields, that's something that is an important consideration. In Taiwan, we needed to spend a lot of time thinking about sound waves, which had to do with the speed of the current and where things were, where the water was moving. And then you do have things like mud types, sand types. You want to be able to dig, you want to be able to put your foundation into something that will hold the foundation, because the foundation is heavy and the turbine is heavy. And it's important to have a good sense of what it is you're going to be putting your turbine and foundation into before you proceed. So that's an important consideration. Environmental considerations. This is obviously an important topic for all sources of power generation, but where is your area near a sensitive species? Is it impacting migratory birds? Is it or migratory fish? Will it impact tourism? Will it impact fisheries? And it's not just about the site of the foundation of the wind farm, it's also where the cables come to shore. One of the advantages of export cables versus multiple inter-array cables is you have a single point coming to shore versus a multiple. That matters or doesn't matter depending on where you are and population density and coastal areas. But it has the it's one of the topics that we like to think about when we proceed. Where are you in relation to grid? As developers will like to build the onshore substation, but we have to connect to the electrical grid that comes up. And so so you want to be as close to the grid as possible. And finally, weather conditions. So, when I was in Taiwan, we were conscious of typhoons and hurricanes. I think in this part of the world, we have to be conscious of icebergs in a different way. So and so you want to ensure that you are also in an area that doesn't impact the amount of construction installation you have. Sorry, I just noticed that I have gotten some questions. I'm going to take a moment to answer some of them. I see the first question about wind turbines and the blades only last for 20 years. So the earliest wind farms that were started 20 years ago were commissioned for 20 years. They're coming to end of life, and now we see that they can last longer than that. So some of the earliest wind farms that were put up in early 2000s. Now that they're at what at the time was believed to be the end of their design life, are showing that they can continue and are being recommissioned for another 5 to 10 years. It's very common in industry now for projects to even if they're not not being fully designed for 20 years, even if if the business case is not showing that they'll last beyond 20 years, there's an understanding among the commissioning that they can be designed and the life asset of them goes to 30 or 35. So 30 to 35 is becoming a new baseline assumption in industry, even though it wasn't at the beginning of the industry. With respect to the P10 profile, the P10 profile is typically used to assess. The P10 profile is at the high end of your generation. So it's rarely used as a base case. And it's your upside. If you are generating, as a developer, when you sit down with your lenders and think through, well, what's our business case? You're typically using the P90 or the P50. And then when you're describing internally, what's our opportunity for upside? We'll look at the P10, but no one relies on it because we're taking a view that over 30 years, it will happen sometimes, but it's not going to happen regularly. And as for the final question, plans for Nova Scotia or Canada recycled blades, we don't have wind farms yet, so I have not been involved in any conversations about recycling turbine blades. As sort of indicated, we're looking at projects that are 30 to 35 years old, and we will, as I talk about later, the projects in Nova Scotia aren't going to. The most recent interim regional assessment express that the earliest projects in Nova Scotia wouldn't be coming online probably till the early to mid 2030s. So we're talking about sort of an issue for the 2060s, 2070s that I don't think there's been a lot of effort at looking at yet. There will be with time maybe, but not at the moment. I'm going to continue with the presentation. And I'm sorry, on potential areas for Nova Scotia, I think that's my next. There, I think that's my next picture. So this picture was released, or this map was released as part of the interim report for regional assessment of offshore wind. And it has, this is the first thing to mention is that this is not by any means final. It was proposed for potential sites identified by the regional assessment, but it's not explicitly created as final sites. Nonetheless, it creates kind of a sense of where projects might be. They're located in these areas for a combination of proximity to grid, proximity to ports, and avoidance of icebergs and excellent wind. And so, earlier I'd mentioned that one of the positives about Nova Scotia is that the water is shallow for long. This sort of demonstrates that. By contrast, if we think about the west coast of North America, it gets very deep very quickly. So we don't have they don't have this same sort of blessing of geological conditions that would allow us to build offshore wind this far away from the shore. Next, offtake. So this is an important question for all projects, and particularly at the moment for new projects all over the world. Offtake is basically shorthand for who is purchasing the electricity. Electricity tends to be purchased in what we call PPAs, power purchase agreements. And the PPAs are the agreement from the off-taker to buy the electricity from the generator. We often, in Nova Scotia, and conversations I've had with people, this often also gets described as route to market. What's the route to market for our projects? That's another way of saying who's the off-taker for these projects, which is another way of saying who will buy the PPA for these projects. In Europe and Asia, and for onshore and solar through much of Canada, most offtake agreements or PPAs have tended to be with a regional system operator, an ISO, that purchases the electricity either through a feed-in tariff contract, a wholesale market price plus a contract for difference, or often set through an auction or RFP. In Ontario, they had an active feed-in tariff regime for early stage onshore and solar projects through the Green Energy Act that was introduced in 2008-2009. Ontario now is just doing RFPs for new green energy, and so they've removed sort of as the industry has evolved and become more sophisticated, that the need for tariff support doesn't exist anymore. Instead, it's just bid in on price. So that's kind of as industries mature, you move to RFPs and away from feed-in tariffs. In the United States, you're seeing also some combination of. But the United States has pioneered the corporate power purchase agreements, where a large off-taker, and recently we've seen the likes of Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, Oracle, etc., buy electricity. The U.S. also uses combination of renewable energy credits, or RECs, as well as tax credits as a way to provide support to projects. So whereas in Europe and Asia, you've seen a lot of support through feed-in tariff contracts, or in other jurisdictions, feed-in tariff multipliers. The United States sees a lot of corporate PPAs, but across jurisdictions, it's a mix of everything, and there's not one way to develop or sell renewable energy or offshore wind. In Atlantic Canada, we're looking at multiple routes to market. Self-use, which is to say offshore wind sold directly to an SPI and used by Nova Scotia consumers, or green hydrogen production is a topic that's come up a lot, or export to other parts of Canada. The Atlantic Loop concept involve that, or also there's conversations about export to the United States. So for developers, when we look at the offtake, among the most, there's two or three really crucial questions. Price obviously is one of them, but the other is the length of the contract and the credit worthiness of the offtaker. So a contract that's an excellent price but is short with someone who might not be able to pay is not as valuable as one that is a fair price over many years with someone who you know for certain will pay. And this is a challenge for different parts of the world as they've tried to move away from the model of ISOs or regional utilities purchasing on behalf of retailers, and where retailers are stepping in directly, is the quality of the buyer really matters, and the length of the project really matters. The offshore wind projects are very expensive. Many of us, and I'll get to this in a future slide, many of us work with lenders to fund the project that and like a mortgage for your house, it's paid back over many years. We have a lot of our lending agreements. Some of our lending agreements can be as long as 20 or 22 years. So you need real certainty of payment from the buyer in order to ensure that you can get the debt to match the equity that you're putting into a project. I see there's a bunch of questions that come up. Let's take a peek at them. Just looking at some of these. I'm going to get through my presentation and then come to, I think, some of these questions at the end, because I think a lot of them will be answered through the remaining slides that I have. So I'll come back to some of these questions once I'm through. Thanks. The contract structuring. So I have to be honest. This is not my favorite slide for showing contract structuring. What I wanted to try and find was just a chart that showed different kinds of a contract structuring. Instead, what I found was different kinds of contracts. And so this helps to provide context. But let me take a step back and describe at a higher level what I mean when I talk about contract structuring. So in the world of offshore wind developers, again, it's a small number of companies that can do it because of the capex requirements and the marine having the complexity of marine construction and engineering. So in very broad terms, the few dozen companies that can do this fall into two broad categories. One is companies that balance sheet finance, and another is projects that project finance. The balance sheet companies tend to be larger utilities or maybe oil and gas companies who might enter into as many as 300 contracts directly. As they balance sheet finance, which means that they are building the project from their own cash flow. And often they'll sell down some large portion of it to other shareholders once the project has been de-risked, and often at a premium. They can also often keep the construction contract and keep the O&M service agreement for themselves, such that they will make fun, or they earn revenue both from selling down some portion of the project. They earn money from cash flow from the project, and then they earn money from building and operating the project. But the larger balance sheet companies will perhaps enter many of these contracts, and this is just a sample, by themselves. What I've listed here is sort of tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. Sorry, I'll take a step back. Then the second group of projects, the second bucket of companies, project finance. And I'll talk about project financing in the next slide as well. But in project financing, which is what Northland does, we will put equity into the project in a range of 25 to 30%, and then we borrow the rest from a group of lenders. And we would borrow 70 to 75, ideally 80% of debt from a range of lenders. And in that process, we tend to have a smaller group of contracts where, because the lenders want certainty that the project, that they have insight into all of the major deliverables and all of the major packages and all of the major projects. So the project finance led projects are offer a smaller lender group or a smaller contract group, and in which we would enter into contracts with the tier 1 projects here, and then those tier 1 projects or suppliers would enter into contract or subcontract agreements with suppliers in tier 2, tier 3. So I guess in the point of this slide is to indicate that there's an enormous amount of opportunity to be involved in an offshore wind farm, again, there's up to 300 contracts all the way through. In some instances, the owner operator will enter into and manage that contract themselves. In other instances, it will be as a sub-supplier, subcontractor to one of the larger OEMs or original equipment manufacturers who are sitting on top of the contract pyramid. Typically, we will aim to have 10 to 15 contracts with, as someone who does project finance, we aim to have 10 to 15 contracts. Our lenders also like to have understand who is responsible for a specific deliverable and wants to know that they have the credit security behind them to deliver. So, but I guess again, if there's one takeaway from this concept of contract structuring, it's that there's two broad buckets: one, balance sheet finance, and two, project finance. So this slide shows a little bit what project finance looks like. This is sort of the financing process. From if you conceptually can put this into what that development cycle graph from the start of the presentation, this would be one of those work streams. But effectively, as a company doing project finance, we're looking for debt to pay for 70 to 80% of the project, and we work with lenders to put that together. Lenders themselves, and when they're putting upwards of 70 to 80% of the cost of a wind farm together, they want to understand what's happening. And so they go through a whole diligence process. They diligence our proposed suppliers. They diligence our proposed contracts. They want to know, and we want to know, but they also want to know, in addition to us, where risk lies on construction and execution. If where is the interface risk? If something happens between when the foundation has been installed and the tower and turbine above it, whose responsibility is it to fix it? Is it the foundation supplier? Is it the turbine supplier? So there's an entire process of working with lenders to go through the array of suppliers that we put together and understanding where risk allocation lies. So a lot of financing is risk identification and risk allocation in terms of understanding, in the event of a problem, who is responsible for solving it, and what are some of the financial penalties referred to often in these contracts as liquidated damages for delivering late. Also, what are the rights to exit or terminate or replace if a supplier is not delivering. But as with, again, if there's a takeaway from this slide, but also the whole presentation, it's just that this is a really long process from start to finish. Our Hai Long project had over 20 lenders putting anywhere from, I might get this wrong, but it's somewhere in the range of 150 to 300 million Canadian each. It was a $9 billion financing. And so there's a lot of debt in that. 9 billion Canadian. There's a lot of debt in that, and each of the lenders wants to ensure that they are that they understand what they're lending into, and that they're protected if the project doesn't go to schedule. Two last slides, and then I'll look at the Q&A again. This is just two construction schedules. One for our Hai Long project in Taiwan right now, and one for our Baltic Power project in Poland. What's sort of interesting about them, and I'll show them back to back, but they're roughly the same size, but the Taiwan project is longer, and it's longer because the climate conditions are different. And this goes into how every wind farm is unique. We have, and again, Taiwan is a unique jurisdiction with some permitting and procurement requirements, but this shows and this is a public document, this shows our construction schedule for the Hai Long project across some of the primary installation packages. Looking at this, foundations for fabrication and then installation, the transition pieces and the turbines. These are the main parts or the most expensive parts of the wind farm. But, if I were to add a few more things here, it would also be the offshore substation, it would also be the inter-array cables and installation, it would also be the export cable, and it would be the onshore substation. Those are all very significant packages, which all of which are in the critical path. If any of those are late or delayed, it can delay the whole project. So every wind farm is different, but the actual construction process, while long, is actually, again, long and different jurisdiction. It's the end of a multi-year process. From start to finish, it can be 8 to 12 years. And we are early in that process in Nova Scotia. So we will, I'm confident and excited for there to be offshore wind in Atlantic Canada and Nova Scotia, but it's a multi-year process. That will take time for industry to develop and prepare for. But we have everything in place. We have excellent ports, we have excellent workforce, we have government support, we have great wind, we have great geological conditions. We need to figure out route to market. And once that's in place, I think there's an excellent opportunity for us to build offshore wind in Nova Scotia. So that's it for me for now. I think I'm roughly at time, and I think there's a lot of questions. So, Lisa, you tell me if you want me to go through them or if you have something you want to start with.
If it's easiest for you, what I can do is actually kind of just go through and facilitate and pick some of them. I don't think we're going to get through all of them, but I do appreciate the attendees being so participatory and asking a lot of questions. It's great to see. So it was obviously a great presentation that brought up a lot of questions and interest. So if that's okay with you, Sean, I can just go through and pick some.
Yeah.
The one here is, what do lenders and/or Northland currently see as the greatest, or say top 3 risks for a project in Nova Scotia? And I might combine that with, there was also a couple of questions around what are the greatest challenges. So kind of something along that theme from your perspective.
Yeah, so I think Nova Scotia is a really good jurisdiction for a lot of reasons. At the moment, the biggest uncertainty, I guess the 2 biggest uncertainties are one, we haven't actually had the release of the final auction rules and lease rules yet. So there's a number of companies here preparing for that, but we don't, until we've actually seen what the lease rules are in terms of the timing of auction, but also what do we need to have in place in order to bid? What do we have to have in place if and when we've secured something? It's hard to plan what will be the size of the potential size of the projects until we have real certainty on timing and size of wind farms. It's hard to do a lot of in-depth planning. So if you think back, or I can even if we think back to that initial project stage cycle, we're in we're still in that first 1 to 2 year period of site selection, and until we're past that, a lot of the we don't ramp up in engineering and procurement and financing. You don't get deep into that because right now everything is just conceptual. So the first thing is what are the rules around bidding and having permission to develop a site. The second thing, which we touched on a little bit, but it is route to market or offtake. Nova Scotia has a target of 5 gigawatts of leases by 2030. Nova Scotia's total grid is about 2.5 gigawatts. So obviously it won't all be used in Nova Scotia. We need to find a way for those additional electrons to go somewhere else. And that's either as molecules in green hydrogen or through New Brunswick to other parts of Canada, or with an export corridor to the United States. In all likelihood, it'll be some combination of those. There is some opportunity for self-use in Nova Scotia, but not 5 gigawatts. So it will be the figure once we understand the route to market, then that will also provide some additional certainty.
Great. And actually, and you and I have chatted about this before with Nova Scotia's focus also on the green hydrogen market and using offshore wind for that. One of these questions is really pertinent to that. So the question is it preferred to have electrolyzers located near the offshore turbine in the sea or onshore to reduce LCOE?
That's a good question. I'll be honest, and I don't have a great answer to that. Ultimately, I'm not a green hydrogen producer, so the part of that answer will come from the green hydrogen, the price at which they can sell it for. And the electricity loss you have moving hydrogen from ocean to land versus the electricity loss of cable from ocean to land. Without knowing a lot about it, and I would suspect that you have less electricity loss with an export cable. But part of the appeal to offshore electrolyzers is that we have pipelines already from the Sable Gas and other ventures. So we do have existing assets that could be reused, and that might offset the cost of building offshore cables. I guess my first instinct would be that it's cheaper onshore, but I say that without having actively investigated it in much detail.
Yeah, and that might actually, there's a few questions around research gaps and things like that. That might be an area where, some work needs to be done to understand it more just from the Nova Scotia or Canadian context.
Yeah.
One question we have here, I think is very relevant again to the Nova Scotia context that could be helpful for some of the attendees. So the question is, how did Northland Power engage with local fishing communities during the development and operation of offshore wind projects in Taiwan to manage resource conflicts and ensure coexistence? There's another one on that one, but I'll leave it at that one first.
Yeah, so there's a few things. I think as a starting point, you have to engage with fishers with respect. This is an industry that is a livelihood, and for which, whether it's Nova Scotia or Taiwan or anywhere in the world, these industries have hundreds, sometimes thousands of years of experience. And so you have to you go into these conversations with deep respect for that expertise, deep respect for the role of fishing in local communities, and deep respect for legitimate concerns, and a willingness to share as much information as you have, or as is requested, so that we can, and to be transparent, because it's a potential source of tension and concern if you're not upfront and honest with what you know. Taiwan was a little bit different from other jurisdictions, in that actually the government prepared a fisherman or fishers compensation formula, and so that was used as part of the negotiation. So that I think is unique, in that the government, before any of this began, the government already had a process of determining compensation depending on where a wind farm was located. Also, there's as you get into these conversations, we touched on this a little bit, but this is where site selection is really important, because some areas are more or less impactful, and it's part of the conversation with fishers. They know better than we do where the best areas are, and those are areas where you avoid if you can. In many parts of the world, the deeper sites Part of the appeal of deeper sites is they tend to have fewer marine species than nearshore sites, because deeper water means less sunlight reaching the ocean floor. So you have less flora, so you have less fauna. There's less plankton and seaweed and other underwater species for fish to eat. So often, part of the appeal of not just deep water but of floating is that the farther out you go, you are often impacting fishing communities less. But again, that's part of a conversation with those communities.
Right, right. Well, thank you. So we are unfortunately at time, and there were so many great questions that we didn't get to. But I do want to thank you so much, Sean, for your time and putting the presentation together. I think it spurred a lot of obviously questions and interest and thoughts around, what's happening globally, but also, what should we be thinking about in Nova Scotia? So thank you for that. And for those of you that we didn't get to your questions, this is where I come in with my plug for our conference that's happening in November. So there's going to be a lot more offshore wind topics and updates during the conference. It's November 19th through 21st in Halifax. You can have a look on our website for the conference program and speakers. So I'd encourage you to register if you haven't already, because a lot of the conference will be focused on offshore wind. And I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. We're going to have our next webinar on Ask an Expert early in 2025, so stay tuned for more details. But we also welcome any thoughts you have on other topics you would like us to dive into. We're always happy to get those kinds of ideas. So thank you very much, and thanks again, Sean, for joining us today.
Thanks, my pleasure.